Excited to be back here in Austin. It's been nearly 5 years. That's so weird. Hi, my name is Bill, and like Travis said, I'm the editor for the Nordic APIs presence, and we're talking about APIs all the time. You know, the design of APIs, the strategy, security of them. And for this talk, I wanted to do something a little bit more thematic with what's happening here in Austin this week. If you didn't realize, South by Southwest is going on. It's this big music festival, and they do tech stuff as well, but I wanted to see how we could bridge lessons from music into what we do with APIs. So in my talk, I'm going to be looking at what are the similarities between making a hit API product and making a hit album. And the more I started to think about this, I realized, well, hey, there's kind of a lot of similarities between the two, which I'll go through in this presentation. It's by no means inclusive of everything you need to consider, but I'll just highlight some of these overarching categories. So let's just dive in. Lately, both in the tech world and in music, you sort of have to specialize, right? People like to have a very distinct sound, and micro is in both worlds, I would argue. I remember when I had iTunes as a kid back in the day when it was just starting off. These were the broad music genres in, I think, the first iTunes player. We had rock, blues, jazz, classical, electronic, country, R&B, soul, hip-hop, rap, alternative pop. Things were simpler back then and kind of lumped into these large categories. And the same could be said, I think, about enterprise software, right? Things were more monolithic back then. We had enterprise resource planning systems, content management systems, point-of-sale systems, all kind of bundled together in these large, massive, monolithic services. Flash forward to today, and things are a lot more complex. If we're thinking about the music industry, well, micro-genres are really popular right now. There's all sorts of these unique little subgenres out there, and the online communities have just really emerged around all these little subgroups like bedroom pop, C-punk, witch house, chillwave, vaporwave. It just sounds like nonsense, but there's like millions of people that are into this kind of stuff. I had to look up breakcore recently, which was my favorite discovery here. It's basically like mall music or elevator music for when you're like literally on break. There's like millions of people into that right now. It's awesome. I think the same parallel could be said about microservices, right? Things are more specialized, and we're seeing a lot more fit-for-purpose designs out there these days. Case in point, at this event, we have a signature API present, LumenSign. But there's all these microservices, which are often exposed via API for things like weather, user profiles, product catalogs, social media, SMS, email. You know, things have gotten more micro, and this microservices architecture has flourished in recent years. So specialization, both in making music and in making software, I would argue, is popular right now. But how small is too small? This is an interesting study that someone in the API community, Bruno Pedro, recently published, and I thought it was kind of interesting. And he looked at the impact of a large number of API features, trying to see, well, can the amount of API features be related to the success of a business? And he looked at what we have here is the HTTP method on the left, the API features, and the actual capabilities they provide. And so he was able to find that a ratio of operations per feature is below 10. So perceived complexity can impact support requirements. If things look too complex, it might impact discoverability and developer experience. So I would argue how we kind of construct the service and how our APIs and the methods are exposed to the end developers matters. So thinking about how we can segment things in that way, I think, is important here. Because when it comes down to it, the developer experience matters with APIs, and just like with music, the listener's experience matters. So I would liken the listener to the developer in this analogy, quoting the Jimi Hendrix title, "Are You Experienced?" So The developer consumers are like the listeners of music albums. And why does developer experience matter lately? Well, specifically for APIs, I mean, the sheer number of APIs out there is approaching a staggering number. A recent F5 report found that we're nearly at 200 million, they estimated, concerning both public and private APIs. So just as a matter of having a competitive advantage among all these competing services, I think that's a big reason why developer experience matters right now. Another reason is that investing in developer experience could help reduce cost, right? If things are more usable, there are less resources expended trying to learn about some sort of developer resource, and thus things are more efficient. You could make the argument that improving developer experience internally could reduce developer churn, thus saving some hiring costs. I put it out there recently on social media, and the answer was a resounding yes. Investing in developer experience can actually reduce costs. Lastly, I would argue that developer experience is a natural marketing tool. If you have a great developer portal out there, developers will like using it, and you'll experience the greatest marketing technique of all time, word of mouth, right? And how to make a great developer experience? Well, I made an article about this recently. What it comes down to, I think, is just getting to the point, telling me what this thing does, having public documentation, not sharing some sort of PDF over the wire, showing developers the code, making sure your landing pages are optimized. Something that I see APIs doing successfully is having an authentication or authorization guide up front, making sure that's obvious, that the workflows are documented and easy to go through. One big pain point I know for a lot of developers is that their open API specifications that they're looking at don't always match the production realities. So watching out for drift there, I think, is important. Having a playground just to quickly test API calls, I think, is a great perk, and embedding that within the developer portal itself is nice for developer experience. But better yet, I've seen a lot of VS Code extensions being made lately that actually help integrate this kind of functionality just directly within the integrated developer environment that people are already using. So I think a great developer experience in the future will just get things closer to where the developer is already working and what languages they're already comfortable with. Lastly, as Travis mentioned, and I think we'll see more of in this event, we're going to see a lot more with AI and the use of generative AI. Excited to see the next presentation after me on that front too. And I think there's a lot of interesting use cases for that, how that could be used to improve the developer experience with API integration. Just to kind of make this analogy go a little more deep, with iTunes, right, you can have like some sort of 30-second listening, a instant playback just to test a song before purchasing it. And now with streaming platforms, sure, you can listen to anything immediately for free if you're willing to listen to the ads as well. So I think the same thing could be said about developer portals, right? Let them listen before they buy. Have a quick and easy way to test API calls to see what the responses look like and what the requests look like, and have that easy copy and paste ability to generate these samples in whatever language they're comfortable with. So just some high-level tips around increasing the experience. Something that also matters for music is, I mean, you have to have a good name, right? You have to have a good band name, and if you're making an album, you got to have a good name too. One of my favorite names is Random Access Memories. This is a Daft Punk album, and I thought the double entendre was pretty appropriate for a tech conference with RAM. And naming matters with APIs, right? One developer even went as far to say, coming up with variable names is literally the hardest part of being a developer. And the API community, thankfully, has generated a lot of thought pieces around what naming actually looks like, you know, using resources as nouns, pluralized resources, forward slashes for hierarchy, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to dive deep into all this, and I'm sure a lot of you are already considering this and have already implemented naming conventions for your services. But just goes to show that in my whole analogy, like parallel here, it's naming matters with APIs too. Something that also matters a whole ton for both is quality. When Steely Dan produced Asia back in the 70s, this was pioneering a lot of contemporary recording techniques. And if you go back and listen to this album, it doesn't really sound like it was produced in the 70s. It sounds like it was produced in the 80s or 90s because they were doing a lot of innovative techniques with like spot miking instruments and making sure things were very precise and crystal clear. So I would argue that APIs need to be quality too. And how do we get those kind of Steely Dan level APIs? Well, I would say that they're well composed and intentional. They function as expected. And I think if we were to liken the analogy of notating music to design first, I think that's kind of what we talk about with APIs. They're well performed, they're highly performant, they work as intended, they're produced well, they're meeting modern standards in the industry, and maybe even like Steely Dan, setting the tone for the future producers. And they're precise, they're not having any errors, not having any vulnerabilities. So how do we make sure our APIs are as good of a quality production as Steely Dan? Well, one way to do so, I would say, is to run them through benchmarks and quality testing with other APIs in the industry. There's this one provider, or a website, I should say, that does this well. They're called API Context. And they are constantly ranking the performances for a bunch of popular APIs. This is for the fintech space. As you can see, Stripe is up here at number 1 with a high pass rate, high quality score, and relatively low latency to some of these other performers. And we can also look at AI. OpenAI is pretty high up here with latency is kind of up there, but compared to some others on the list, maybe not as bad. And what's interesting about this site is that it's showing performances based on your geographic location too, so you can see like how the different servers around the world are performing. So having a keen eye into performance standards and I think response times and latencies is important because people want APIs to work quickly and efficiently. Another way to test for quality is through schema scanning, right? We've noticed at Nordic APIs, we've kind of been covering the emergence of a few of these in the market, like API Insights, Rate My Open API, and Escape is doing this. They're basically some free services you guys could use to test your open API definitions against industry standards according to design, performance, and security. So for this talk, I took OpenAI's YAML Open API specification and ran it through these definition scanners. And it did decently overall. API Insights found some inconsistent naming, so that's kind of what I was talking about earlier. It found like there weren't many error responses that were well attributed, so they could have used more description on that front. They found a lack of performance headers and some other performance-related policies were missing. Rate My Open API found similarly some missing operation descriptions and missing examples and undescribed errors. Escape ranked it pretty decently for security, just found one potential for information disclosure based on the schema as well as testing some of these requests in production. So API quality screening can help improve quality, especially if you're going design first and using specification-driven development, because you could be testing this before anything is released, really. Okay, Another similarity between producing albums and producing APIs is that style matters. And this album cover is from one of my favorite bands, My Bloody Valentine. They make very dreamy, ethereal sounding music, and so a lot of style, I would say, goes into these recordings. So, what are the current style expectations with APIs in the market right now? Well, if we look at API architectural design styles, REST is still top dog. It probably doesn't surprise people here. What's interesting, I thought, about the latest Postman State of the API report was that GraphQL finally usurped SOAP in that number 3 position. And SOAP is more of a kind of a legacy format. I think we'll continue to see it wane in popularity over time as other newer entrants like GraphQL and more asynchronous formats come onto the scene. And a lot of people in this space will tell you, hey, you know, there are use cases for using these in conjunction, which we've talked about on the blog quite a bit. Now, is there anyone here managing an API portfolio and also keeping a style guide for your services? Okay, yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That's like a lot more than I actually thought would raise their hands. I think that's great. I think having a style guide can help you conform to some of these expectations that I've briefly referenced in this presentation so far. I mean, we're dealing with a lot of disparate formats and varying style conventions across a single organization. So having a style guide to kind of consolidate those ideas and let developers know what your expectations are up front, I think is important. Here's another resource for y'all. APIstylebook.com is a cool website where it's showcasing style guides from companies like Atlassian, Cisco, Google, Microsoft, Heroku. Even the White House, I think, has a style guide that's public for people to look at. So those could be good models if you're looking for some inspiration and creating an API style guide. Being an editor, I had to put this slide in, right? Because like style guides are kind of my bread and butter when it comes to writing. Another thing is consistency, right? We just talked about API portfolios. You don't want every API to look vastly different. And consistency arguably matters with music, too. And this is the band Weezer. And they are kind of famously known for these album covers that look almost identical. And people just call it the blue album, the green album, the red album. And they're all just called Weezer. And that's how people call them. And then the teal album, I think, was sort of made as a joke by them because it's just like a cover song album. So find your sound, right? That's what they say in the music industry. Well, consistency is typically beneficial in API development too. Kristen Womack at the Platform Summit last year had a great analogy for this. She described it as similar hallways. So if you are maintaining a big inventory of APIs, you're making sure that each separate product has a similar developer journey, right? There's like a similar getting started area, a similar documentation, code samples, and maybe even a sandbox testing environment. So having something that looks and feels similar for every service that you're exposing to developers, I think is just going to help increase developer experience, makes things more consistent, just like Weezer. Because unfortunately, we can't all be the Beatles. I'm sorry. Yes, they redefined their sound from album to album and had some cool trips and experienced new things. But as API designers, it's probably not going to be the path we take. Another thing is cataloging, right? Both albums and APIs end up being cataloged. If we're talking about albums, the record label usually assigns some sort of alphanumeric number for each release. And for example, the Beatles' Abbey Road is SO383, released on Apple Records. And both tend to have documentation, right? Albums have liner notes, and APIs have great documentation, and it's all comprehensive, and it's all there, everything you need to know all the time. Well, unfortunately, that's not actually the case. This report was kind of damning. It found only 10% of organizations fully document their APIs. That's from a 2023 report from Enterprise Management Associates. And 52% of respondents to that State of the API report that I referenced earlier found that a lack of documentation was their biggest problem. So I don't think it's always the API developer's fault. I mean, they might just be wrapping some sort of internal database and exposing it to maybe their application or maybe some friends in the organization. But when it starts to become more of a thing, when other partners and maybe external consumers start to integrate with it, well, the lack of documentation starts to become more of an issue. Plus, if some of these endpoints are exposed on the public web, I mean, there's just scanners automatically looking for those kind of vulnerabilities just constantly. So I think documenting them and knowing where they are is a first step toward having more of a secure foundation. Because if we don't, we could run into sprawl issues, right? Because as I said earlier in the presentation, there's just so many of these services being created on a daily basis. The sheer increase in APIs could lead to some sort of unmitigated technological adoption with APIs in a company. And if we're not having enough governance around these endpoints, if we're lacking standards around them, yeah, I think sprawl issues could start to emerge. Rapid's 2022 State of the APIs report found that companies with 10,000 or more employees tend to have over 250 internal APIs. So I think a lot of the stuff I just mentioned around inventorizing your catalog and making sure that you have the correct governance around it, those kind of issues are just going to become more apparent as time goes on. I think this was evidenced by some risks that were added to OWASP's top 10 for APIs in 2023, especially improper inventory management. That's a new highlight on that list of top API risks out there. People aren't really consuming third-party APIs that well. They're kind of just trusting their outputs, which maybe we should have more validation for those integrations and not just blindly trust their outputs. And we found that unrestricted access to sensitive business flows, that was a new risk on that list. So hackers are finding ways to exploit the business logic, and not just technical gaps, but how the API is actually constructed. And that's another risk that is being posed on organizations. Both are products, right? If we consider albums and APIs. For example, Thriller is one of the most successful albums of all time. It has sold over 66 million copies. So how do we make API products on the standard as Thriller? Well, there's many, many ways to go about that, but I think first is a mindset shift to realize that the API is just another product. And the future of APIs is all about product management. This is what Jason Harmon recently said at the Platform Summit last year, and I trust this guy's advice. I mean, he ran API programs at Expedia, PayPal, and now is CTO at Stoplight, and API Intersection podcast host. I think he has a good idea for trends here. But when you think of productization, sure, you might just monetize an album by charging for a CD or a record or a tape if you're going to go all retro. But on APIs, well, it's not always direct monetization, right? I think a lot of organizations are reaping other benefits. Maybe there's some sort of revenue share agreement, or maybe they're utilizing APIs as more of a marketing tool, or it's good for partner-to-partner integrations. It might be some sort of add-on to an existing platform, right? In 2020, Programmable Web, under the MuleSoft label, published this diagram of all these types of API business models. And the productized and coin-operated ones, which we would call direct monetization, that's only a small subset of the available business models out there. So yeah, I'd recommend people tackling an API strategy, just to kind of think of all the different potential business models out there which could be relevant. Regardless, APIs and API-related implementations generated 41% of revenue for organizations in the US, found a 2023 report from MuleSoft and Deloitte. Some songs are just a one-hit wonder. Like we all probably know Take On Me by a-ha, right? Some of their other songs do not have as many plays. Let's just say that. The same is sort of true with APIs. You're gonna run into the fact that developers want to use a certain endpoint more than others, right? Treble did an interesting study recently, and they found that 20% of API endpoints just remain unused for a whole calendar month. I thought that was pretty eye-opening. They also found that Git is used, maybe overused. Everyone's using Git, they love it. So what's your one-hit wonder? If you understand, what is that method that developers are continually integrating with, well, hey, that could help refine your marketing efforts. Maybe you want to focus on that use case and onboard new people with that in mind. So I think monitoring your service and looking for those behaviors could be super beneficial. I think this is my last comparison between the two is security. Just as in music, just as in APIs, you have to secure your IP. Case in point, in 2011, Skrillex, the famous dubstep electronic producer, lost an entire album when his laptops and hard drives were stolen. And similarly, organizations are facing a lot of threats lately in terms of APIs. 60% of organizations said they experienced at least one API-related breach in the past 2 years, found Traceable's global state of API security from last year. So API attacks are on the rise, and they're opening up new lines of attack. I recently looked at 5 different examples of recent breaches. A lot of them have to do with data being overshared through faulty, unauthenticated endpoints. For example, there's this T-Mobile hack where 37 million accounts were compromised with some sort of authentication issue. Some are having direct monetary repercussions. I mean, Kronos, the cryptocurrency platform, experienced an attack in late 2023 through just leaky, unauthorized API keys, unfortunately. And the attacker was able to steal an estimated 25 million in Ethereum from the service. Optus is an Australian telco provider, I believe, and they had 11 million consumer records leaked from an open endpoint recently. There's a lot of other case studies around just leaky API keys. I think an Escape study recently found 18,000 API-related secrets and tokens were just left exposed on the public web. So it's a big deal right now. But on the other side of things, just accurately constructing your service, avoiding data overexposure, taking a zero-trust mindset, ensuring proper authentication and authorization for these APIs is just becoming more and more important. So those are all the comparisons I have here in this presentation between producing an album and producing an API. So I just wanted to end by saying, be a producer, go produce and be prolific API rock stars. And if you like some of the content in this presentation and want to learn more, check out the Nordic APIs blog. We're running a lot of thought pieces on the API economy, looking into design and strategy. And we're also open to contributors. So if you'd like to write for the blog and have a cool API story to share, just contact me sometime. All right, thank you for listening. Yeah.